Estamos começando com Café Pesquisa. O tema do nosso Café Pesquisa hoje é sobre pesquisas empíricas, economia de dados. Temos a participação de receber aqui a professora Mieke, da American University, a Luiza Nassif, que vai apresentar também esse trabalho, e como comentadora da nossa atividade de hoje é a professora Ivette. Então, agradeço profundamente as três por terem aceito fazer esse café com pesquisa com a gente e introduzir um tema que está ganhando grande dimensão, porque nós estamos percebendo no Brasil e no mundo uma mudança importante do perfil demográfico das pessoas, e esse perfil demográfico está exigindo olhar o que você faz com as pessoas que vão se envelhecendo. E também não é só um processo de mudança do perfil demográfico, mas também uma mudança na composição das famílias. As famílias são cada vez mais monoparentais. Então, toda a questão dos cuidados está se tornando um tema extremamente estratégico para pensarmos o futuro da humanidade. Então, por isso, é uma grande satisfação realizar aqui esse café e pesquisa com essa temática. Obrigado. Então, passo a professora Mieke. É verdade. Obrigado.
Obrigada, professor Dari. Eu vou estranhamente falar inglês num público em português. Para o professor, a gente decidiu aqui que a gente falaria inglês. So thank you so much, Mieke. It's a very big pleasure to have you here. Mieke Meurs is a professor of economics and co-director of the program for gender analysis in economics at American University. Her areas of research include household behavior, firm organization, and local government in low and middle income countries. Professor Meurs holds a PhD from University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and a BS in political science from University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she is a Fulbright scholar, spending some time here with us at Unicamp. So also, if anyone wants to talk to her at some point about your own research, have conversations, that would be lovely. We are going to also be setting up office hours with her eventually for our students here, and I'll keep you posted on that, but also feel free to come talk to us at the end of this discussion. And now I give you the floor. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. So thanks everyone for coming today, and also for speaking English, or listening at least in English, so that I can participate. I appreciate that. Okay, so today, let me just check the time. Okay, so it's 20 minutes, so that's like 5 after. Oh, thank you. Yeah, okay, great. So the paper I'm presenting today is a joint work with Sara Costa Pereira, actually it's spelled wrong, but so she's a master's student at USP, and also Rafaela Rodriguez, who is a lawyer at the law school at American University, where I am, and also Cristina Diacelli, who's at JET. So we've been working on this paper together, and I wanted to share the results with you today. So the title, yeah, so the paper is on paid care workers, paid domestic workers. So that means what you think of as maids or housekeepers, and the care deficit in Brazil. Keyboards. So first I just wanted to, I'm going to go through the first slide to get to the empirical part of my research, but I wanted to set up the issue a little bit so you understand why we're doing this research. So first of all, care. What is care? So care are the activities which provide the physical and psychological and emotional needs of people who need care. That is, people who are dependent on others to have those needs met. And so a lot of feminist economists have been doing research lately on the value, the economic value of care. And so some of the research has suggested that, I don't know how many zeros there are there, but a very large amount of dollars could be used to describe the value, the economic value, the dollar value of paid care work in the world as a whole. And if American women earned the minimum wage for their unpaid care work, we think they would earn altogether about $1.5 million US per year. So why do we care about this? It might be big, but so why should we care about it? So what we're arguing is from this economist is that care is very important for economists. A piece of the economy which has been ignored, which is very important. It's important for growth because care is linked to labor force participation by women. It's very important for fiscal health, also because of the labor force participation nexus, right? If women work in the paid labor force, they pay taxes, they pay into pension funds, and so that affects fiscal health. Of course, it's important for gender equity because if women are doing all the care work, they have less time to work in paid work, they have lower incomes, they have fewer pensions, and so on. And for the same reasons, it's important for poverty. And then, of course, during COVID, everybody got a close-up view of care as everybody was stuck at home where care was being produced. And that also increased the attention on care. Oops. Thank you. That's great. Okay, so because of the importance of care, feminist economists have been working to incorporate the care sector into macroeconomic models. And so part of the motivation for the research today is our need to incorporate care into macroeconomic models. So just to give you a sense of how that works, and probably most people aren't familiar with this, what we're going to be doing in a macroeconomic model that includes care is we're going to be including and disaggregating the care part of services. So we think about some education services like preschool. We think about other kinds of social care, private care for children in the home or babysitters in collective organizations, private care for elders, again, in the home or in community centers maybe, that are run privately, private service substitutes for non-household, non-care services. So that's one big part of what we're trying to incorporate. That is the paid care sector. And economists are also trying to incorporate into our models of our macroeconomic models unpaid care work, and that's what I've highlighted here. So the non-GDP sector. Right? So people are trying to assign a dollar value to that unpaid care work. I just showed you some of those dollar valuations. And then we're going to incorporate that as a sector into macroeconomic models. So as we're doing this macroeconomic modeling, it's very important to understand how care is produced in the economy, because otherwise we can't incorporate it directly into our macroeconomic models. So where does the data come from for doing this? So for the unpaid care work, most of the data comes from time use surveys. So about 170 countries now collect time use surveys where we use the time diary most often to ask people every 10 minutes, all day, yesterday, what were you doing? Then we know how many hours people spent in cooking and cleaning and care for children and care for elders. And then we can assign a dollar value to this in ways that I won't take time to talk about now, but we could talk about later if you like. And then we want to also incorporate the paid care sector. And in some ways that's easier. We can use administrative data, how many child care workers are there. And we can also use the household consumption data. So we can ask household, how much money did you spend on a babysitter, and so on, right? And so one of the pieces of data that we collect in household consumption surveys is data on domestic workers. So the problem is that when we collect data on domestic workers, and we know that a household hired them, for example, full-time or 2 days a week, one thing that we don't know is how much care domestic workers provide. They're cooking, they're cleaning, but often they're also providing care, but we don't know how much care they provide. Time use surveys, which collect the data that we use on care in household and unpaid care, omit most domestic workers because time use surveys only collect data on people who live in the household. If a domestic worker lives in the household, we likely collect data on what she does, but if she doesn't, we don't collect the data. And very few of the people who are hired to provide care in homes, especially in countries like Brazil, are hired specifically for that task. So if you look at people hired in the expenditure survey, something like 4% of them are hired as a nanny or as a nurse for an older person, right? So those people we know provide care, but all the other 96% of people who are hired to work in the home, and they are hired as general domestic workers. We know that going back to the times of slavery, these people provide care. It's part of their understood role, but we don't know how much care they provide. So now I want to, again, very quickly just go through get some understanding about the care needs for people who might not be familiar with this. So just quickly to get a sense of how many children go to preschool. So we know that between 0 and 3 years of age, this is from PNAGE, I'm pretty sure, from 2022, not very many children go to preschool. I think it's about 40% when you put them together. But for older children, 4 is compulsory schooling already, and we already don't have 100% attendance. So those children don't go to school at all, right, and need care all the time. And then if we think about care for older people, again, just very quickly, so this was the Brazilian population distribution in 2019, and you see a nice bump here in the working age population, right? You have lots of working age people, fewer people in the dependent zones of the table. But here, if you look at, this is for 2060, which is not very far off, and you see that the distribution of the population changes radically. And it's almost the same, right, all the way up and down, which means that there are many more people of working age who are going to need to provide care for older people. Right? So it's a context in which we expect some pretty significant care demands. This is just to remind us all that women do much more care work than men do. So the blue bars here are women's time in care in average hours, I think, per week. And the orange bars are men's, and these are just for different groups of households, children under 3, children 3 to 6, 6 to 12, no kids. Right? So it's interesting, even in households with no children, we see significant amounts of time. And then last part of the background, 2 more slides, I think. So this may be part of the reason why we see among women in Brazil fairly low labor force participation rates. So these are also from PNAGE, and you see that it's pretty flat, right? Over time, this is 2012. Haven't seen much change in women's labor force participation rates, and a little more than half of Brazilian women participate in the labor force. So maybe we don't think too much about care deficits, that's my topic, for women who are at home, but about half of the women at least are working, and we might think about them as having a care deficit. So our project is to think about how important domestic workers might be in Brazil in filling in a care deficit. I'm going to define the care deficit in just a minute for you, right? Or more specifically, the way we're going to frame the question is, are households with higher care need more likely to hire domestic workers? Again, thinking back to the macro modeling, we're trying to figure out how to include this demand for domestic worker care properly into a macro model. So there is a little bit of previous work on this in Brazil. There's a book from 2022 by Guerra, but they were using data from 2008, 2009, so kind of old data. And there, chapter 5 in the book actually does some kind of economic analysis, looking at the hiring of a domestic worker, and then a set of demographic variables on the right-hand side, including how wealthy the household is, whether they have small children, whether they have old people, and whether they work. But these variables are all considered separately, right, as different possible explanatory variables for hiring a domestic worker. And not surprisingly, they show that households that have small children or households that have older people are, in fact, more likely to hire a domestic worker, as are households where both members of the couple work. Okay, so now getting to the care deficit. So what do we mean by a care deficit? There's a literature I discovered where people are talking about this kind of idea of a care deficit, and it's used to describe at the household level, not having enough time to provide the needed care. So there are two papers on this. One is Guarnizo and Rodriguez. They looked at the hiring of domestic workers in Los Angeles, and they did a survey of households. And the way they measured the care deficit was to ask the question, which is, how challenging is it, if at all, trying to balance the demands of your professional career and your everyday responsibilities and tasks attending to your family and household needs? And people answered on a 5-point scale. It's really hard. It's not hard at all, right? And that was their measure of the deficit. The other paper by Blair, Loy, and Jacobs is a qualitative study of U.S. stockbrokers. They interviewed 60 women stockbrokers, and the women described their difficulties in balancing, their work life and their care life, and they looked at the impact on families. But our idea, good idea to hold that. Our idea was to think about a quantitative measure. I mean, when I heard the word deficit as an economist, I'm imagining that there should be a quantitative measure there, right? But there weren't any quantitative measures. So we wanted to try to come up with a quantitative measure. Hold on one second. Okay, so what we were thinking is we're going to figure out, and I'll tell you how in a minute, the time needed in this specific household for care. And then we're going to subtract the time that family members have available for care. And we're going to call that the deficit. And we're going to do this given the labor commitments of the family right now. Who's working? How many hours are they working? Of course, we know as economists that these things can be endogenous. Of course, how much I work also depends on the care. And we know that it's probably a simultaneous decision, or at least that's how people modeled it. So this is a descriptive analysis. We're looking at the current situation. We're not explaining how we got to be here. And we're going to ask, is that care deficit statistically associated with the use of domestic workers? Okay, so we use the Brazilian Household Budget Survey, the POF. We use the modules on household characteristics, on labor, and on collective expenses. That's where the domestic worker spending is, and we have a large number of cases. Okay, so the first thing we do before we actually measure the deficit at all is to just look at care time needed. And I'm going to tell you in a minute how we calculated that. Care time needed per working age adult. And what I want to show with this graph is just the big tail here, right? So most households face a care need of about, 48 to 20, something like that, 20 to 48 hours per week of care needed per working age adult. Okay, that's a lot of care. But also there's this big tail. There are some households that have very high care needs, right? And then we also think about, and I'm not going to emphasize this for issues of time, but we also do this thinking about the problem if it's only women that provide care and not men. And then, of course, you see a higher average. Okay, so how do you calculate the amount of care needed? So we're using a methodology which came from Ironmonger, but is used by the UK National Office of Statistics, or Office on National Statistics, or whatever it's called. So this is a paper from 2013 where they describe their method. And these assumptions, which I'm going to talk about, are culturally specific. They pertain to the UK, but we could easily adjust them for any country's different expectations and still come up with a deficit measure. So the people in the UK assume that children under 12 require 24-hour care. Now here we're including both passive care, that means that an adult is just around in case something happens, and active care. Children 12, 13, and 14 are assumed to require 10% less care per year. 15-year-olds require 50% less care, and children 16 and up require no care. So I put some question marks there because most of you don't look like parents of teenagers, but if you have a teenager, you know that they actually require kind of supervision, right? And then, as I mentioned, these are very culturally sensitive. I work on Mongolia a lot, and children under, okay, I'll hurry up. Children under 12 provide a lot of care, right? They aren't assumed to need care, but we can easily adjust these. I'm trying to show how you might do this deficit calculation. For older persons, it's really hard because not every older person needs care, right? So we aren't able to use the same measure. Okay, so we're going to take, for childcare, we're going to take the time needed. We're going to subtract the time that they're in school because they don't need care for that. So we do that by age, and it's 5 hours a day, we assume. And then we're going to sum the number of children in the family, right, to come up with the total amount of care needed. And then we assume 24 hours a day for adults. We subtract the time that they're working, and then we sum over the adults in the household to figure out how much time they have available. We assume that everybody provides and needs care 8 hours while they're sleeping, so we take that time out, okay? And then we have some different assumptions about whether people's work can be slightly offset, like I go to work at 7 and my spouse goes to work at 9, and also whether children's care can be provided simultaneously or not. I'm not going to talk about that because I'm running out of time. Okay, so these are just the equations we're using. So this is time available. Here we're assuming that 20% of work can be staggered, right? And children's care is all simultaneous. That means that the care need is included for the youngest child, and all the other kids can be cared for simultaneously, okay? And that's our lower bound. And our upper bound is that the adults cannot stagger all simultaneously, and children cannot be cared for fully simultaneously either. Only 80% of their care can be simultaneous, 20% is not, and we sum. And these two are just playing around with the differences in the definitions, middle estimates. For older persons, it's really hard. I had the National Health Survey. I hoped I could instrument it. In the National Health Survey, everybody over 60 is asked, do you have any need for assistance with your activities of daily living, right? So I know how much help they need, and I had all kinds of demographic data, and I was hoping I could instrument for the needs with the demographic data, but no such luck. It's very hard to predict who needs help. So what we did was we made like a maximal possible need for care. Assume you have Alzheimer's, then you're going to need 112 hours of care a week. And then we subtracted, just like as we did with the other one, the time available among adults, right? And we assumed that older people could all be cared for simultaneously, and we limited this to adults over 75 because they're more likely to need care than adults in their 60s. Oops. These are our measures of the deficit. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. There we go. These are our measures of the deficit. So you see that on average, the deficits are not large. So we see the lower bound gives us about an hour a week, upper bound about 4 hours a week. But those are the averages. Remember, we have those big tails. And for elders, we ended up with bigger deficits, but that's because we made a maximal estimate, right? Okay. And then we'll skip the part about women only, okay? And then we ran a regression, so it's a standard probit regression for hiring, right? As a result of the two deficits, and then what income quartile you were in, and some demographic information like the race and the gender of the household head, and whether you lived in an urban area and region, okay? All right, and then these are our results. So here we see two things, basically, I'm just going to emphasize. First of all, we see what we expected. The size of the deficit is correlated with the probability of hiring a domestic worker. Bigger deficit, more likely to hire a domestic worker. But you see that the relationships are small, so an additional hour of deficit is about a 0.13 percentage point increase in the probability. But remember that there are those big tails, right? So if we look at this over the distribution, we see that, you know, as you get above the 50th percentile in the size of your deficit, the probability of hiring a domestic worker goes up a lot, right? So it seems like at the high end, we're seeing pretty big, I won't call them effects because we don't have causality here, but pretty big association. And then the last thing we did was, you know, there's a big difference in 2013. In Brazil, in the cost of hiring a daily worker or a monthly worker, because monthly workers now have labor rights, right? And so you have to pay Social Security and unemployment benefits and so on. But on the other hand, a daily worker, someone who works 2 or fewer days a week for you in your house, might not be that helpful for care. And so we wanted to look at whether these relationships were different for these 2 kinds of workers. And what we see is that basically the relationship is much stronger for monthly workers. They're the ones who could provide care. So even though they cost more, you're more likely to hire a domestic worker to fill your care gap. And for the daily workers, the relationship is less strong. That's more driven by your income and your where you live. Concluding, because I'm out of time, so we estimated child care time deficits, and they suggested about 1 to 4 hours a week on average. The elder care deficits were hard to estimate, but our estimates suggested about 6 hours a week deficit for a maximal estimate. If only women provide care, which I didn't have time to talk about, but you get, of course, you get bigger deficits. These care deficits are positively and significantly correlated with hiring a domestic worker, suggesting that domestic workers are a source of care, particularly monthly workers. And last slide. Our assumptions about staggering work, which I didn't have too much time to talk about, and simultaneity care have large impacts on the estimated gaps, particularly the staggering of work. The associations are small, but we have that large tail, and for people at the tail, we see a much larger relationship. Women, we'll leave that out for now. So what we want to argue based on this is that it is very important for us to try to figure out how to measure care so that we can incorporate that into our macroeconomic modeling and our policy simulations, which Luiza is going to talk about later, and that the changing legal and economic landscape of care, of domestic workers may have a pretty important impact on care in Brazil. A colleague of mine, Cristina Viacelli, has written a really interesting book showing that the available supply of domestic workers in Brazil is changing a lot and really declining, and so that might be an important part of thinking about the care policy kind of situation. Okay, stop there.
Ah, tá. Mas você tá me mexendo muito, não? Sim. Isso aqui é. Tá. Warnings.
You may give me warnings, yeah.
I'll put a timer for myself as well,
Yeah,
just in
no
case I
problem.
forget to look at it. Yeah. Bom, well, I'm going to speak in English, right? Okay. Which is a little weird, but that's fine. The paper was written in English, so that's a good thing because I have to listen in English, but not in Portuguese. Anyway, so this paper is a joint paper with João Pedro Freitas, who's from MAGE, and Lucas Teixeira, who's also a professor here. And we're going to be doing some simulations to look into the impacts of 2 different types of care policies in Brazil, one through public investment and the other through tax incentives. So I'm going to give some context, and honestly, a large part of this paper, because it is a paper written in English, so a large part of this is really giving the Brazilian context. So when we think, okay, so when we think of care policies for Brazil, there are many specific aspects of our own reality that needs to be taken into account. And because this paper is kind of focused on a broader, an international audience, we have like every time someone reads the paper, they come back saying you need to give more Brazilian context. And more the paper is becoming just a Brazilian context and less about the results itself. So I'll see what I can do in terms of mixing it up here. The motivation for the paper basically the exercise itself, when I think of it as a Brazilian, the results of it is quite trivial, because basically we're going to be looking to what is the impact on inequality and who are the people that benefit if the government were to increase care services, public care services, versus just giving tax incentives for people that pay taxes. And we know, obviously, that in one case, inequality is going to increase, on the other, it's going to decrease. In one case, Black population is going to be more supported, and the other is going to mostly be white folks. So we already know that before starting, in a way, but at the same time, we've been doing a lot of these exercises almost as a kind of a rhetorical tool for policy making. And I'm going to give you also some context into Brazilian tax structure and Brazilian tax reforms that have passed over the years, because this explains a little bit why we decided to do this as well. Another aspect of this that is important to say is that I have been doing a lot of work on tax policy in general, and working with other scholars from Latin America, other feminist economists from Latin America. And it has been so when you go into care policy and feminist economists working in policy, they have had this, what we call an instrumentalist approach to this, which has been to make an argument that when you invest, investing in care is an investment. It's government expenditures in care is an investment and not an expenditure. And they have been doing a lot of input-output models. This has been something that has been done a lot to show the multiplier effect and how many jobs are created when you invest in what they call social infrastructure, which could be, for example, expanding child care, versus investing on physical infrastructure, which could be, for example, building a bridge. And that's because when you say investment, really, this means physical investment usually. So we need to make this argument that social infrastructure also should be understood as investment. And this approach has been also applied in Latin America, but with not really as much traction as in other countries. That's what we working on policy have felt, that it doesn't work as well to go to an European finance minister and make this argument as it does to a Brazilian finance minister. And that's because we have a very specific fiscal policy context that has to do with our fiscal rules. So I am going to talk a little bit about that. So this is also part of our motivation. And basically, feminist economists in Latin America have been asked to move from the question of why investing in care to where does the money for investing in care comes from. This is the kind of policy argument we have been have to do. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology and the results. Okay, so Brazil, extremely unequal country, as we all know, that has been able in some ways to, so Brazil is a very unequal country, but comparatively to other countries is not as poor. And part of this as well has to do with our constitution and how much it has been providing in terms of social infrastructure for its population and social services with, of course, our health system, our public education system being a very important part of this. But at the same time that we have this constitution that requires the state to spend a lot on its functioning, we also have a ability of the government to actually, how do you say that? To arrecadar, to collect, thank you, to collect taxes that is very limited. And this has also to do with our inequality. So basically, when you look to Brazil right now, you have just people from the top 2 deciles paying taxes. So being someone that pays taxes in Brazil already puts you in the very top of the distribution. This means that for us to be able to actually collect enough to support the system, we needed to have a much more progressive tax system than we have. And what we have right now is a regressive tax system, especially at the top. So Brazilian tax system is full of regressivity and specific privileges, and some of these privileges has to do with those deductions. So, for example, we have full deduction of private health services through our tax system at the same time that we have a universal health system. This makes not as much sense. And finally, we have been under a kind of austerity moment in Brazil since 2000, I would say 14, but definitely 16 with the Teto de Gastos, which was our fiscal rule, which was a very restrictive fiscal rule back then that had frozen all government expenditures for 20 years. And then when Lula came into government, and probably almost everyone here knows that, when Lula came into government, one of the first things he had to do was change that fiscal rule. And part of this is because the way many of us have been talking about this is that basically this fiscal rule makes the constitution incoherent, because what you need to do in terms of how much you can spend given the fiscal rule is actually contained by, is predicted on the constitution, and it's very hard to actually do that. So somewhere on the Brazilian fiscal context. So this is from another paper from AGE, from Clara Brenke and Pedro Marques, where they, when the current fiscal rule, the novo arcabouço fiscal, which basically is a change on the one we had before, the Teto de Gastos, which creates a possibility of some increase up to 2.5% in the expenditures, and a bottom bound as well for that, and has some counter-cyclical mechanisms into this, but it's still very restrictive. And what the main simulations that have been done so far show is that, one, the primary government expenditure as a proportion of GDP will fall over time with this rule. That's what's on the left. And second is that the expenditures on health, the constitutional minimum expenditures on health and on education will eat more and more of what the government can spend. So this creates kind of a contradiction within our rules, because you have all other kinds of expenditures, such as pensions, for example, that ends up creating this problem that not everything is, our constitution is going to end up not fitting our rules. And this leads us to also think a lot. So on the other side of the fiscal policy is exactly the tax. So a lot of this has been used to argue for more tax progressivity in Brazil. The difficulty with tax progressivity in Brazil is a little clearer when we look into part of the political context around tax reforms in Brazil. So we cite a few words on that, and here I'm going to just be citing a couple of things, but some of the body of evidence we have on that has been done through work by Marta Hetch, who's a political scientist, and she has done a lot of surveys to look into what she calls a parliamentary preference for tax regressivity in Brazil. So basically, 67.2% of the tax reforms presented in Congress created an expenditure deduction, an exemption, or a special regime that has benefited specific groups of taxpayers between 1989 and 2020. So it's much more likely, if you are presenting a tax reform in Congress, it's much more likely that it will only pass if it is providing more benefits, especially for top payers. And we also look into, and this is another, this is a study by Nicholas, oh my God, I'm not going to get his last name, who is also teaching classes here and was at MAGI. Yeah, it's very hard, his last name. Anyway, so this is a research he did as part of his PhD, where he looked into a narrative, he creates a narrative database of tax reforms in Brazil. And what he sees is that between 47 and 2017, 11% of the reforms that were presented intended to increase government revenues, and only 15% of them were justified in terms of tax justice. And 70% had to do with modernization, economic growth, or inflation correction. So the type of policies that are presented, so it's not only a bias on the type of policies that pass from Congress, but also the policies that are even presented in Congress. So given that context, that fiscal context, that in the one hand creates a rule on the spending that would create a need for the government to increase tax revenues, and on the other hand, you have a political barrier to actually increasing those revenues. We have, in the middle of all of that, a lot of advancements in care policies in Brazil. So in December last year, we had the national care policy being approved. And it's really funny because the national care policy in Brazil was approved 3 days after the approval, not the approval, sorry, the presentation of the expenditure cuts. O pacote de corte was presented 3 days before the national care policy, which supposedly would necessitate an increase in expenditures to actually be able to be put forward. The way the national care policy has been set up in Brazil is not that they are proposing to create an actual system or a national care system. What they are they have a national care secretariat that is going to be kind of supervising, creating a plan and working together with a bunch of ministries and with municipalities and states to provide, supposedly to provide eventually universal care for everyone, but working through the idea that they are going to do this progressively. So kind of looking to who are the people in more need, so kind of taking into your work, looking to those with the most care deficits, providing for those first, and then kind of expanding the service eventually. But this is under, and like they are kind of this umbrella with all of these other things that already exist, such as the SUAS, the SUS, the public education system, and so on. So the other part, so they're kind of trying to put together a care plan without a budget, without an actual budget. The budget comes from the ministries that already exist. So for example, when the LOA was being discussed, basically what they were hoping for is that the SUAS would get more money. So the social assistance ministry would need to get more money because they have identified that most of the care that they need to provide has to do with elderly people. And this is where most of the deficits are. But basically, they have been working through that way. They have been working as well, for example, with emendas parlamentares, for example. That's another way that they can try to provide more services, but they don't have a budget of themselves. Okay, so now kind of closing up this context part, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the step-by-step procedure we did to do the simulation. So the idea was to show, given that there is this parliamentary preference for tax regressivity and for tax deductions, and there is an actual constraint politically thinking of, there is a constraint on the fiscal space, given the fiscal rule, which also two aspects on that are important to think. One has to do with the fact that the fiscal rule does give preference for investments, but the understanding of investment on the fiscal rule has to do with physical infrastructure. So care would not fall into what they're calling investment. So this is one thing. The other is deductions are expenditures, but they are not understood as expenditures. And this is another thing we've been saying a lot. Tax expenditures are also expenditures that are, but because they actually affect the revenue and not how much was spent, they kind of come through a different way. So the way the rule deals with this is that you could not create a new deduction if you don't follow the rule on the previous year. So if you are unable to actually abide to the rule on the previous year, you would be able to create a new deduction. So what we did was to look into these two exercises. So what if the government decides to increase care services through a tax deduction for those services, or if it decides to actually use the same amount of money that they're giving up on when they are giving that deduction to create a care service. The way we do this is using the POFI and the and data from the tax revenue data. So we use the distributional national accounts methodology by Piketty and Saez that does the, well, I'm not going to go into details on this, but basically it uses the Pareto interpolation method to kind of take the data from the tax revenue data to input that into the top of the distribution of the POFI. What we know is that surveys in general are very bad at predicting what is the income that the top of the distribution receives. So they usually tend to really underestimate the amount of income that are being received there. So there is this method that has been used, especially if you want to look into inequality, for example, in a country. You need to correct the survey data using as much information as you have. So basically, you take the tax data that you have available in your country, you input that into your expenditure survey or your household survey. So it could be done with PNAD or POFI. And then you make that compatible with the total income using national accounts data. So use 3 data sets to actually correct that. So we do that first. So we use the corrected POFI. And then we calculate how much would be the tax deduction and the tax expenditure. So basically, we look into the total population on the top that are actually taxpayers, see how much they would, how much they pay in percentage of their own income, and they would be able to deduct from the tax base any services such as child care, elderly care, and so on. So we look into the pocket to see how much they spend on those, and we create a rule that they would be able to deduct those from their tax base. And then we calculate what would be the tax expenditure of that, because it wouldn't be the total, it would be whatever is the percentage of taxes that you actually pay on that. And with that, we get a number. And that number, so another thing is that we are not that able to calculate the total amount of tax expenditure just looking into POFI. And we can see that especially with health services nowadays. So if you look, and there's another aspect here, which is if we are to create a policy where people can deduct care services, they might use more care services. So this amount that we calculate there, we use as a lower bound for how much this policy is going to cost. And then we also create a higher bound. So that accounts to about 6 billion reais. And then we also create a 10 billion reais amount to do the simulations. Then we do 2 simulations. The first is the in-kind benefits. So basically we go back to the POFI and we look into who are the people that use us, that are more at the bottom of the distribution and that actually uses services, user public services, such as education, the health system, and so on. And we distribute to them this care services as well, proportionally to what are their income. The details are on the paper. To see who would benefit from each policy in the sense of who are the people actually receiving something. So together with those 2, the tax deduction and the in-kind benefits, we can distribute on the POFI who are the beneficiaries of those two alternative policies. And then we take this total amount and we also look into an input-output model to see how many jobs would be created if we do policy 1 or if we do policy 2. There are certain details on that I'm going to get to when I get to the graphs. Oh, wow, I'm out of time. Okay, so the first thing we do is also looking into POFI. We calculate the impact of that on inequality. And it's important to note 6 billion and 10 billion is not that big of an impact, of a shock to actually move these things too much, but you still do see a little bit. So the Palmer ratio, as expected, right? Tax deduction are going to increase inequality because they are going to be a benefit just for those who pay taxes, and by default, those are at the top of the distribution, while public services are used by the base of our distribution, so those decrease inequality. And also it would impact women's income share. But those results are very small exactly because of the size of that. So we look into how they're distributed as well. So when you look into public care services, that's on the left, basically almost 70% of it would go so almost 70% of it would go to Black people, while if you look into the tax deductions for care, only about 30% of that would go to Black people. So there is also a very important racial aspect to using policy 1 or policy 2. Also, when we look into men and women, there is a difference in distribution, and this is not as striking, and it's never going to be as striking because of another problem which we have in general when we're using data from households, which is we need to create some kind of rule of distributing this among the family. So data is collected on the household, and the way almost always do this is that we calculate the income of that household and distribute among the parts equally, as if it is distributed equally. So if the household is composed by a man and a woman, they're both going to be benefiting from this. But still, because there are many solo mothers, families, and so on, we still see, especially at the bottom of the distribution, we still would see that the public care services would mostly benefit women, while the tax deductions for care would mostly benefit men. Finally, when you look at this exercise, when you look into the composition of the deciles that would receive this, you see that the public care services, because it's a universal service, that would really be a little bit more distributed to the base of the distribution, but like all along, all deciles would get part of this. It's very equally distributed, while the tax deductions for care goes mostly to the top of our distribution. And then the job creation part, which is the input-output simulation. So we don't have, as you were saying in the beginning there, like if we are doing a macro model, ideally we have the care sector as a sector in itself. We don't have that, and we don't have enough information for kind of creating that one single column on our input-output table. And I'm sorry, I could have spent a lot of time explaining input-output models here. That's not what I'm doing. But the idea is that through an input-output model, you can look into how much each sector uses of other sectors, and you can calculate the multiplier effects of jobs and so on. So you can shock one single sector of your economy and see how that spills over to your whole economy. And basically the simulation we did here is that we shock public education, public health as sectors that are somewhat similar to what a public care sector would be. And those create jobs very similarly for men and women. So half of the jobs that would be created if you are doing if you're doing an investment in public education, go for men, half of those go for women. And that's not only the direct jobs created there, but it's all the jobs created on those sectors, all the sectors that are going to be also used from those sectors and so on. And we also have in our model what we call the induced effects. So also all of the wages that are then created through these jobs that were created are used to buy more things that then create jobs themselves. So it's a model of all of those multiplier effects in itself. And the tax deduction for care not only are going to create less jobs, but it tends to replicate a little more what is the distribution of jobs in the economy. Because basically the impact that a tax deduction for care is going to have is giving money in the hands of people. And the way we did the simulations, we're actually overestimating the impact here because we didn't want to impose even more assumptions here. But we are not assuming some kind of propensity of consumption just of the rich people. We are really simulating as if this was something that was given to the population as a whole. So we're using the consumption of all families and giving money on their hand to look into what would be the effects of them in the economy as a whole, given how much they spend. So only using the input-output data for that. And then we also do a simulation of by race and gender, who would receive those jobs. And for that, we use also data from the HIGE to open up the input-output labor data. And basically, we also see, and this is something that is important to think as well, even when you're just replicating what is the expenditure in public education or expenditure in public health, you're mostly going to be creating jobs for women, but those are mostly white women. So there is needs also as well to kind of combine this kind of policies. But yeah, so in all of those simulations, except in expenditure in public health, Black women are going to be the least, the ones that receive the least number of jobs in that. Okay, so concluding, so the idea is that this parliamentary preference that we observe towards tax expenditures and not towards the increase in public services has costs in terms of inequality, in terms of the people that benefit the policy, but also in terms of the number of jobs created and the distribution of this. So this even would be against the idea of creating a higher GDP impact. I think this is, yeah. Thank you. And then I have some. Não, melhor não. Tá bom. Você pode sentar. Agora é minha vez?
Agora está vez.
Tá bom. Well, first of all, thank you, Luiza and Mieke, for the invitation to make part of this session. The papers are not part of my research agenda as a researcher here, but definitely is a subject that interests me personally as an individual and a member of the human race, right? So even more being a woman, as we already observed, right? So I think that both papers are very interesting and they complement each other in the sense that one brings, for example, the elderly people, the dimension in the analysis of the deficit on the provision of care, while the other paper brings some possible strategies to deal or at least to to build or implement a national care system for the Brazilian case. And all these dimensions are extremely relevant in my point of view, or from my point of view, in the sense that, as Professor Dari already mentioned at the beginning of the session, we see that the distribution is crucial age or composition in terms of age as a population, global and also the Brazilian and in general Latin American population is changing rapidly. Therefore, these policies in terms of care provision, not only for children, but also for elders and maybe also for people with disabilities that in a manner may need also this type of care are extremely important. I was very curious in the case of the paper of Mieke and their co-authors of understanding a little more about the non-linearity that the paper shows in the relation observed between the likelihood of hiring domestic workers and the child care, if I'm not wrong, right? Because it's not usual to expose these non-linear relationships, but I don't know if maybe it may be explained maybe because of the inequalities on income distribution. And I was wondering about this because in the paper of Luiza, we observed a strong asymmetry in the distribution of the benefits of any of the possible policies if we decompose these benefits in terms of the size of income. And this pattern, from a point of view, is also a kind of stylized fact because we also observe these asymmetries in terms of income distribution and other issues, for example, in food insecurity or in access to jobs with a better quality or to formal education and so on. So I would like, if possible, that if you can enlighten us a little more about these non-linearities that I consider very, very curious. And also, I would like to know better if, also to explain a little in your paper, these limitations on the lack of data for elderly people and for people with disability that was not contemplated in any of the papers. And what would be the steps that maybe we can follow to surpass this situation given the national or the global context of the aging of the population. It was a pleasure to read your paper. I will be looking for reading more about your research. And thank you for this opportunity. In terms of the paper of Luiza, I was also
very interested in the empirical exercise because I enjoy to explore data and provide insights and elements that may guide the design of public policies. For example, this is my research area, data. And I think it was very challenging to produce a data lake incorporating all these databases, COF, PNAD, RISE, national accounts, tax data. So I can't imagine how it was performed. And I have some questions also about this, more than recommendations. First of all, I understand the point that in general the results show that the better benefits come in fact from the investment on infrastructure for a national health system. But both strategies bring some sort of benefit. Also, the investment in infrastructure also contributes to reduce some inequalities, especially in terms of if you consider a distributional income. However, I understand that the tax deductions in fact do not contribute, for example, with the reduction of the good transactionality of gender and race inequality, which is an important subject for us also. Latin America in general, right, and countries the worst. But couldn't be, given that we suffer from a lack of more articulated national care system, maybe and considering the challenges of the implementation of any policy in that direction, maybe to propose a quick off, considering these tax deductions, given that this is better than nothing. Just a reflection, I was just thinking, right? I think that these questions actually covers all my subjects. There is only one other thing in terms of jobs that I also consider very interesting. And there is where you emphasize the limitations of the policies promoting new jobs that do not contemplate or maybe that covers less Black people, especially Black women. But I don't know if any of these policies will in fact, I don't think that they will solve this structural inequality that we suffer historically. And I don't know if this would be the case where we can analyze not only these policies that we propose in the paper, but also maybe an conjoint effect, considering, for example, other strategies such, for example, the capacitation for these more vulnerable people that have more difficulties, for example, to enter on the formal labor market or to face opportunities for better jobs or for a better wage or for a better job with more quality that also contributes for a better life quality because they are not, in fact, formulated to generate jobs. It's an indirect effect. So why not contemplate this problem, for example, in a vision of a complex systems where educational policies or capacitation policies work together with these fiscal policies or any other policy towards a reduction of these structural inequalities that historically are very challenging to reduce and that they reduce, in fact, historically, but a very, 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 very low speed. That was a reflection that I was building as I was reading your paper. It was very, very also interesting to read, and I thank you too for this opportunity to read this. Thank you again, both of you, to allow me to participate here, and I think that those would be my reflections, although they are more questions than reflections. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivette.
But should we do responsible first? Yeah, maybe.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, on disabled care, so this is very important, of course. We didn't try to include it because we had no idea how to estimate the time, right? We just don't have enough data. I'll come back to that question in a minute. On the nonlinearity, I think that's also a really important question, and I can see you read the earlier version of the paper because the current version has it's an interesting question, and in this area of work, there's a lot of debate about the simultaneity of care, right? And the economies of scale in care. But what the data suggests is something more like diseconomies of scale, right? If you have a small care deficit you can manage, you can come home from work early, or maybe you mentioned about the correlation between income and care. Maybe you're like a professor like me, and if you have higher income, you're more able to have a flexible job. I'll work a few hours from home, So when you have a small deficit, maybe you're solving your problem like that, But as your deficit gets bigger, it becomes harder and harder to do that, right? Or even to hire a housekeeper 2 days a week, right? So I'm kind of thinking that maybe even though the literature thinks a lot about economies of scale, we might think about diseconomies of scale, right? Because just thinking about your own family, if you have a couple of kids like this, things spiral out of control. Okay, and then just very quickly on the data. Data, we're so at the beginning, and the time use surveys have been great, but time use surveys are very poor at estimating time on elder care. People seem to underreport enormously. Nancy Fulbray has a very good UN Women paper on this. And so I think we need a lot more data on that. South Korea worked with us to collect data on not how much time, but at least the frequency. Like, okay, your mother needs help feeding. How many times a week do you help her eat, right? Your mother needs help going to the toilet. How many times a day do you do that? As a beginning to get that kind of a sense, right? And I think we desperately need a domestic workers survey where we interview domestic workers about how much time they spend in care, because we really have no idea. And of course, it's very hard to go into people's private homes to do this, but you have unions and other social organizations that work with domestic workers, right? So there could be a collaboration between the union or the other organization and the workers themselves to fill out the surveys, at a worker hall or something like that, right, to collect this data. And it would be huge, I think. And then I'll stop there. And
Thank you.
okay. So first, like, on how all this data work is done, like co-authors, like they are same thing. And there is a lot of we have economies of scale. So for example, the interpolation of the coffee and the national common staff was already done for another paper that John had worked on. And also the idea of doing this paper came from the fact that João was working on another paper to do in-kind benefits, looking into the public education and public health in Brazil. So he had already all the code for setting up in-kind benefits and looking into the deductions and all that, and the data from the coffee collected. Okay. And also, Lucas Teixeira had already produced the input-outputs induced effects table for another paper he had worked on. So this is also how, like, it ends up that there are so many co-authors in this thing as well, because some of the data was already worked, and then the input-output model, that's the part that I did, but there were parts that others did. So this is how we can do so much. It is a lot of data. So tax deductions, I think in countries where you actually have a higher percentage of your population paying taxes, it might make more sense. The problem with Brazil is that you already have I mean, I can only think of deductions when I'm also looking to other aspects of the Brazilian tax structure. One is that it is really just the top of the population that is paying taxes. The other is that the tax is regressive at the top. So you already have that the top percentile is paying about, I don't know, 2% effective taxes on their income. So as you're adding more of income that is not actually taxable, there is already too many exceptions in the Brazilian case. Take capital gains and profits, for example. So this is also part of this research is also part of kind of trying to make a little bit of awareness of what tax expenditures are, because people don't think of them as expenditures. Like, and I'm not talking about Brazilians necessarily, but like in general, they're not treated this way. The other thing, I think there is like a political importance. So for example, if we take specifically the tax deductions for health in Brazil, the way this is working is also that people are not really pushing to have better services at the SUS. The fact that the top of the distribution is using a private system is one of the reasons why we have such a bad or kind of a not as well kept public system. If there was pressure from the top of the distribution to make the public system better, maybe the public system would be better as well. So I think that the tax deductions for health, in that sense, works kind of doing the opposite for us, which is like, oh, like, you know, rich people don't really think of it. They don't really need that system, and they can even deduct their private expenses from their taxes. So I am politically against tax deductions, but I do understand also the problem of like you need something until you're there. So I don't know, maybe other types of tax benefits, be it to the service themselves that are private, some kind of, I mean, I don't know, with there has been a lot of discussion on the public-private childcare in São Paulo, for example, and a lot of progressive people are completely against tearing down that system just at once. So I think there are other ways of dealing with this that are not the ideal way, but I don't think tax deductions are it anyway. So, but, and then, yes, I don't think, and maybe this, you're giving, the last comment you made, I think this is important for me to go back to the paper and see how the narrative is going, because the idea is not to say that, that the distribution of the jobs being more equal, for example, or being more to women than in the tax deduction in the public education sector, is one to say that this is a way of solving structural labor problems in Brazil. Not at all. This is kind of one more argument of why this policy is better than the other. So it is because it creates more jobs, those jobs are better distributed. But I also do think it's good to show that it is better distributed, but not that much better distributed anyway. So then we can also make an argument of, even when we're doing this type of policies, we do need to combine it with, as you were saying, so like Black women are not necessarily as benefiting from this type of policies than white women. So we do need to create ways of them being pulled into the job market more. And I think this is in general an argument that I try to do with this type of papers as well, is that given our structural inequalities, policies that are not targeting specific groups, they are not going to resolve those problems. There is a lot of people working with policy in Brazil think of the racial problem as just a reflection of the income problem or the poverty problem or the inequality problem, as if doing certain policies to the bottom of our inequality are on themselves going to solve the racial issues. I don't think that's the case at all. I think we do need targeted policies in some ways. And this other paper by João Pedro, the one where he does the in-kind distributions of public health and public education, he finds exactly that there is an absolute limit on how much that resolves racial inequalities on itself. You do need targeted policies, especially for racial issues in Brazil. That's absolutely clear from any work we do. I don't know if I responded, but yeah.
Yes, no, my point was in the sense of doing something. We will consider that we are facing kind of globalization that may idea would contribute to improve our situation in terms of investments for
Mm-hmm.
that was my point. I agree with you, and also in terms of race and income, depending on the narrative, we are talking about not the source, but the result of
Mhm.
others.
Yeah.
And also,
Thank you. Okay, now let's open to.
if anyone wants to ask in Portuguese, I can just ask slowly and I can translate as they're asking.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is John. I wanted to find out, so first, congratulations for the paper. I wanted to find out whether you see a very strong correlation between reduction in working hours and the deficit in care. Your presentation showed a certain deficit in care, which in your measurement, looking at the duration, it included duration of working hours and auto care which is given. So do you see that it is more effective in reducing working hours for people to solve the deficit problem, or it is more effective in kind of shifting the labor focus of labor from probably other engagements which they are, and encouraging more people to go into paid care as a form of employment? Thank you.
Hello.